No, I can pray. I just like have to concentrate. I'm not saying and I say a lot when I pray.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're so glad that you're able to be here. And we have a topic today, which I hope will be of interest to you. And it is the Abraham Kyper thesis delivered at Princeton on the faith-science debate. And perhaps not a debate in his mind, but before we get started, let's talk about, let's read the scripture, Psalm 118:24. Would anybody like to read that for us? Psalm 118:24.
I'll read it.
Thank you, man.
I just gotta get there first.
I thought you had it memorized then. Yeah.
Not this section of Psalms.
Ah, okay. The rest of it.
All right.
119.
What verses was it?
Psalm 118, verse 24.
Oh, 119. Verse 24. Okay.
18.
Oh, 18. All right, so I thought. Oh, okay, gotcha.
That's what you meant.
I did know this one.
Go ahead.
This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it.
Yeah, and Matthew, I'm joking with him because he knows quite a bit of scripture. I would not be surprised if he knew that scripture. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Well, today we want to talk about a gentleman who probably most of you have never heard of. And his name is Abraham Kyper. When Abraham Kyper was born, his parents took him to the doctor because he had an abnormally large cranium. And the doctor examined him to see if, in fact, there was some form of a birth defect. And what occurred is the doctor came back and he said, ma'am, your son just seems to have lots of brains. That's why his head is as big as it is. And true, that was almost a prophecy. And he is the quintessential Renaissance man, even though he perhaps would rather be called the quintessential Reformation man. And what did he do in his lifetime? He just did a few things. He started a university called the Free University of Amsterdam. And so he did that in his spare time. Started a newspaper, was a journalist. Oh, and he was Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Again, in his spare time. But the thing that he really wanted to devote his life to was, in fact, theology. And so Abraham Kyper is one of those rare individuals that tries to emphasize, trying to be good at what you're called to, try to actually be a powerful influence in society as well as in his own personal faith. Alistair McGrath makes a comment, and I think that our friend Abraham Kyper would agree. A little bit of science will make you an atheist. A lot of science will make you a theologian. And Abraham Kyper believed that, in fact, that sphere sovereignty, or the idea that there are different spheres of life that people should go into in the name of Christ and claim them for Christ, was what he talked about in his famous lecture on science at Princeton University called the Stone Lecture. And I'm not going to pretend that I came up with all of these ideas, because I didn't. I'm going to tell you what he said, and then I might expand upon it. I'm known to do such things, so you'll forgive me if I go a little deeper into some of these topics. So here we go. What did Abraham Kyper say in the Stone Lectures about science? He said it is not an accidental occurrence that science really explodes in the Christian milieu. In other words, while all nations and all people are technological, and what is technology? My definition of technology is the manipulation of nature. And basically, everybody who has a stick and hits a tree trying to get fruit, they are trying to use technology. So all human beings are technological. The degree of technology might be different, but all human beings have a technological basis. And Kyper says, as it should be. He says that the reason that science actually exploded in the Western world has to do with the presuppositions of the Judeo-Christian religion. In other words, it's not an accident. Now, you might say, well, you're just looking back and describing what occurred. Kyper would differ. He would say that, in fact, that science begins in this culture, in this Western European environment, because it has become inundated with certain principles that lead it and guide it in its thinking. And so what are those principles? Number one, nature is not divine. And unlike Eastern religions where in fact nature is divine, or in fact there is a sense of Brahman, or there is a pantheistic idea, the Christian and the Judeo-Christian idea says absolutely not. In fact, the creator of the box can never be bound by the box, even though the creator can be in the box. Or to put it another way, nature is not identical with God, nor is it seen to be an expression of the nature of God. It is merely his creation, and we should not go past that. Now, what does that mean? As a result of nature not being divine, in fact, nature can be explored. You wouldn't actually try to explore nature if it was divine. And so the lack of divinity as it relates to nature says that in fact there's a telos, or a purpose to nature. And part of that telos, or that purpose, intersects with the placement of humanity in the midst of nature. For Abraham Kyper, he says that in fact it is not an accident that human beings are the crown of creation. And he says that as a result of coming at the very end of creation, or being the penultimate act of God, he says that nature is now understood to be for humanity, and that its purpose is to give glory to God, and also for humanity to have a realm in which it can exercise its ontological capabilities. When we say ontological, we mean the way that in fact human beings are created. Kyper says, having been made in the image and likeness of God, it would be natural that we would be creative. In other words, if you have a creator, it would be natural that you as human beings would be creative. Albert Einstein said these words: "The most incomprehensible thing to me is that the world is comprehensible." And it seems as if there is an anthropic principle. Now, you might say, well, maybe we're just imputing onto nature what we want to see in it. Perhaps, and that is a possibility. But even in mathematics, even such a person as Pythagoras found math itself to be quite mystical. Alfred North Whitehead was a mathematician in the Vienna Circle, and his specialty was philosophical mathematics. Perhaps you did not know that such a thing exists. But in philosophical mathematics, Albert North Whitehead came to the conclusion that the universe, once explored, is filled with math. So much math that he said, it is impossible for me to be an atheist. I must move from this position because the simple truth of the matter is the universe is so full of math, there must be a mathematician behind it. For this reason, Kyper said that in fact mathematics and science are the correct application of people who are created in the image and likeness of God. That the reason that math works and the reason that science works is because there's something called cosmological constants that don't change. Let me give you an example. I was on an airplane, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago, and I was reading a book in theology. The man next to me looked and just noticed what I was reading. He said, "What is it that you're reading?" I said, "Well, I'm reading a book about Jesus." And he looked at me and he said, "I'm a scientist." At that moment, I fell on the ground and began to worship. No, I didn't. But I thought it would be fun to mess with him. And I have a predilection that way. How shall we say, it's biological, and there's nothing really I can do about it. It's a propensity, but I must admit it's purely deterministic. And so what I mean is, I thought I'd just entertain myself as a result of his declaration that he was a scientist. And so I said to him, can I ask you a question? What is your area of science? And he said, "I'm a chemist." I said, "Fantastic. So can I ask you, does H2O have to remain H2O all the time? Or can it be H3O every other day? Or I don't know, maybe every so often, can it just change?" And he goes, "No, it has to stay H2O. We need water to survive." And I said, "Well, how about carbon?" I said, "Can we make a carbon copy of it and it change?" Sorry, that was a joke. And he said, no, carbon's got to remain the same. I said, how about hydrogen? He said, it's got to remain the same. And then he smiled and he said, yes, I know where you're going, and I believe in God too. And I said, oh, I see. I thought to myself, I'm not going to have near as much fun. But when he said that, he said, of course there's a God. It's very hard to do science without a belief in cosmological constants. Now I want to tell you what the famous atheist Friedrich Nietzsche said, who I regard as the most brilliant atheist ever. I think he's absolutely profound. And he says this: the problem that he has with some science is that it seems too linear, it seems too regular. And that if in fact the world was created quite chaotically, it doesn't make sense that there's so much order, or the fact that we even look for order. Nietzsche says that the best description of a scientific worldview would be much more chaotic than it actually is. Correct. As a matter of fact, I was reading Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. And we have a DR in this with some of my students. They're nervous now because they're afraid I might call them up to begin explaining what they've read. Don't worry, I won't. But in the conclusion of his book, I want you to read something that he says. But if the universe is completely contained, with no singularities or boundaries, and completely dedicated to a unified theory, that has profound implications as to the role of God as creator. Here's what he's saying. Even though I championed the idea of singularity, which he did with Roger Penrose, and even though everything in our universe looks like singularity is where we begin, the idea of a single point in time where the universe begins, Stephen Hawking says these words: if that's true, the conclusions are inescapable. There is a God. Now he says, I don't want time to be linear. I want time to be different, which is why we title it as A Brief History of Time. Now, why is this interesting as it relates to Kyper? Kyper says this, that in fact, what you may not know is that a little group of runaway slaves come up with this idea of linear time. And they say it in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, you hear it, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And in fact, there's a moment in time where it begins. Now, what does this mean? Kyper says that it has profound implications, and he's not the only one to notice it. Soren Kierkegaard says this: the moment is pregnant with possibility. And what that means is, since in fact we'll never have this moment again, as a result of the concept of linear time, every moment becomes very, very important. Max Weber worked this out in the Protestant Work Ethic. He said, as a result of the idea that we have only one life to live, now this life is more important and has become jacked up as a result of the crucible of time. In other words, we only have so much of it. This is why we read our scripture today. This is the day that the Lord has made. And the way that you emphasize that tells us something about what you believe. This is the day. You hear it? This is the day. But the next part is that the Lord has made. Now the idea there is that you have been given the gift called time. And so Kyper says that in fact we have to use this to understand how powerful our placement is in the universe. Or to put it another way, you have been placed here, if I may quote Esther, for such a time as this. Now let me contrast it. In Hinduism and Buddhism, you're going to go through thousands of reincarnations in order for you to become one with the all and move up the ladder, so to speak. I've always wondered, if I might add something parenthetically, when a gentleman asked me today at breakfast, Dr. Davis, how might I understand Hinduism? And he said, you have read on this, have you not? I said, yes, absolutely. He said, if you were to lodge a critique, what would it be? Well, I thought of 13. But the first one that came to my mind was math. I said, what you may not know is that the world's population has doubled since 1960. But it hasn't just doubled, it's had a exponential movement. Even from 1830, the world's population keeps going like this. And so the question is, if in fact we see that there is a inverted V going like this in creation, where did all those souls come from? In other words, if we've doubled the amount of souls since 1960, wouldn't you say that they would have to come from somewhere? And if in fact that we have 7 times the number of souls since 1800, where did all the souls come from? And one of the doctrines in Hinduism, which is not accepted by everybody, is that animal souls become human. I'm sorry, sharks still seem to bite and seem kind of nasty. Snakes still bite. I have not noticed an increase in moral behavior in the animal kingdom. Dogs still seem to be dogging it. And cats keep taking naps. Sorry. In other words, are you telling me that there's been an exponential increase in ethics in the world of the animal kingdom? I don't think so. But the difference here between Eastern religion's view of time and the Judeo-Christian religion is a big difference. In other words, if you get 5,000 attempts at a life, you might not be as motivated to change this one. In other words, if you've only got one shot, you want to make sure you get this one right. And so the idea in science is that in fact we've been providentially placed in a limited time, and our job is to do the best that we can in the sphere that we've been placed. And in the scientific realm, Kyper says, and for this reason, Christians should lead the charge in science. Now you might say, well, Dr. Davis, that doesn't seem to be the case. Well, it used to be. And despite what you may have read from Richard Dawkins about Galileo and being told that he can't actually explain how science works, and some of the things that we might have read, like Da Vinci having to actually go to the morgue at nighttime because it was against the law to cut open a corpse, the reality is that in fact, nature is there for our investigation. And we are to poke it, to prod it, to cut it open, because in fact, it has a subservient position in the Christian worldview as a result of its creation. It was not made simply to last forever. And there's nothing in the scriptures that teach that. And in fact, it is to be our classroom. We are to learn of the glory of God, and we are to understand ourselves through looking at it. How do I know this? Because even when mankind falls, immediately nature mirrors what is going on with humanity. God says to nature, "Cursed be the ground because of you." This leads to another premise. Nature is not perfect. And in fact, its imperfection is something that we should study and understand more fully. Kyper says this is part of God's common grace. And what he means by common grace is grace given to the world to sustain the world. Or to put it another way, all truth is God's truth. And so Kyper begins the idea that in fact that nature has a purpose, but its purpose is actually the revelation of God and the enlisting of nature for the common grace motif, basically, that in fact God is sustaining the world even though nature is cursed. Now you might say, well, how does he do that? You might notice that in ecology, that if you harm one part, there's a ripple effect. And that ripple effect creates serious consequences, which, by the way, is why we ought to be concerned about ecology. We have no idea, perhaps, how delicate the balance is in nature. And Kyper would point out that delicate balance is not merely an accident. And here I want to just step away from Kyper for a second and make a couple comments, even though I think Kyper would agree. While we might describe nature's adaptation as something to be marveled at, there is something that I have a question of which I have not heard answered in any of the classes that I took in biology. And what is it? Nature does not possess the ability to produce a desire to survive. And so if you say that survival of the fittest is how nature works, that's all well and good. But I don't recall any rocks having a survival motif or benefit or motive. In other words, I don't see dirt trying to survive. I don't actually see the wind trying to survive. I don't actually see lots of things in nature trying to survive. And one of the things that has been pointed out by people who don't even believe in God is that the origin of the species, to quote Charles Darwin, is perhaps an improper name for the book. It should perhaps be titled The Mechanism of Development, because origin is far too great an idea. And Francis Crick, the co-founder of the DNA, when asked, even though he was an atheist, how did the DNA develop? He said it is far too complex to have occurred in the most liberal estimates of time. To which point people pointed out, so then you believe in God? And he said, no, I believe in extraterrestrials. We should have pointed out that by definition, God is an extra outside of terrestrial. That the fact that you don't believe in God is merely a choice. But if you say that it occurred outside of this, you merely have limited one of the options. Now you could say to me, well, it could be the great spaghetti monster. And that is correct. It would be something outside of nature. Now I don't believe that. I believe that in fact there is a creator God. And I have to say, I think that if we're going to find purpose, and perhaps we should look for it, we find it in being created on purpose. Or, to put it another way, it is illogical that a purposeful act of creation would lack purpose, in that nature is purposely created by definition. Creation has purpose. And so the will to survive is something that I don't think could be manufactured, and I'm not sure why I'm told that in fact that's something that is the ground level of survival is not imputed into it, injected into it, created with it. I'm not understanding how accidents create meaning. And I'm still stumped on that. And I've yet to hear a good answer on how meaning or even the desire for survival can be created from nothing. I don't believe that to be the case. Since nature is not perfect, it reveals the plan of God. The plan of God is that in fact we live in a fallen world, that we have fallen bodies, that in fact our DNA is not perfect in any way. But there is a foretaste of things to come. And Kyper says that human beings, since they are created in the nature of God, have in their DNA a revelation of creativity and coherence. Now this is an interesting point, I think. Van Til, who followed Kyper, said this: all of thought is based upon the presupposition of ultimate coherence. Let me say that again. All of thought is based upon the presupposition of ultimate coherence. I'll say it one more time. All of thought is based upon the presupposition of ultimate coherence. The fact that it is not fully coherent now does not negate the fact that you believe in coherence. How do I know that you believe in coherence? Because you do not react to the world or anything in it in a dispartite manner. In other words, you act as if there ought to be coherence, whether there is or not. The ought that you feel and the ought that you act is in fact an indication of a belief that you have deep within you. And so the belief in coherence is not something that I have to prove. You have it, you show it, and you live like it. Let me give you an example. When you watch a movie and you get to the very end of it, and it doesn't knit things together for you, something happens inside of you psychologically. You don't like it. You get to the point where you're frustrated. As a matter of fact, my wife and I have watched movies, and she would say these words to me: that was a stupid movie. Well, I have to agree. When in fact a movie does not knit together at the end, what occurs is that in fact there is dissonance inside of us. There's something in us going, this is not right. This isn't the way it ought to be. Let me go further. The fact that you think in ought at all is an indication that you believe in something more. Or to put it another way, the fact that you seem to think that things ought to move in a certain fashion is an indication that you do not believe that chaos is ultimate. That in fact you believe that coherence is ultimate regardless of whether you see it or not. Or to use the movie analogy, if in fact a movie were to end, you might be thinking to yourself, there must be a sequel. It can't end like this. How many of you have watched Netflix? And at the end of the season, you go, they have got to have another season. How many in this room, raise your hand, have had that experience? Almost everybody. That's my point. Why would you believe in coherence so much? You say, well, that's the way that movies work. You're missing the point. Movies work that way because you work that way. Yeah. It isn't that the movies created it in you. The movies are tapping into what it knows that you are and believe. And so you believe in ultimate coherence, even though you may not be able to state it, even though you might not be able to fathom it, even though it might seem far above what your abilities are. Neurologically, even in your brain works in such a fashion to fetter out dispartite information so that you can form a narrative in your mind. And the reason that stories work so well in everything, like the Gospels, is because your brain seems to function in that way. Jesus taught in parables because he knows how your brain works. You like a good story. And the reason that you like a good story is because your brain seems to function as if it likes completion. Now here's my question. Wouldn't this be a delusional activity if in fact there really wasn't something that was ultimate in coherence? In other words, why would your brains actually work that way? Now, the quick answer from someone like Richard Dawkins would be, it's an evolutionary principle to help you to survive. But since when did delusional activity help people to survive? Let me say it again. How does delusional activity help people to survive? The reality is, your brain needs you to believe in coherence in order for you to be sane. And we don't generally talk about that. But deep in your heart, you have a presupposition, a belief in ultimate coherence. Human beings like coherence. Now, philosophically, the subject-object dualism cannot be solved without a prior belief in coherence. Now, what is the subject-object dualism for those of you who are not versed in philosophy? It basically says every time there's something outside of me, I cannot have absolute assurance that that thing exists because I can always come up with another way to explain it. In my Christian thought class and in my Theology 1 class, I give anyone an A who can prove to me just one thing, that they exist. So far, I have not given any A's out. But if you ask me, is it rational that you exist? It absolutely is rational. But can I prove it? No. I have to have a belief structure that says that in fact, knowledge is not completely dispartite or chaotic. What you may not know about Darwin is one of the problems that he had and was concerned about was this question. What if in fact my brain was created just simply through evolution to give me a certain way of seeing things that has nothing to do with reality? In other words, what if my brain itself is merely a survival technique which merely tells me what I want to hear? how can I possibly get around that idea if everything is created simply through survival? Let me state it a different way. If in fact survival of the fittest creates all things, then my brain is also created by the survival need. If my brain is created by a need, then it is no longer a rational arbiter of what is true and false. It is merely something that helps me survive, whether it's true or not. Do you see the difference? This is called Darwin's dilemma. If in fact my brain is a product of survival, maybe my brain only furnishes me with the information that I want to know. Darwin admitted it is impossible to get out of this problem. Perhaps the greatest empiricist of our time, David Hume, said these words: when I think about the problem of knowledge and what is called the law of induction, how does correlation and cause go together? And by the way, let me stop right here because I've heard people say correlation doesn't equal cause. That's not true. The correct way to say it, logically, is not all correlations equal causes. But I guarantee you, if I slap you upside your head and you have pain, there will be a cause and a correlation. My hand, your head, and the neurological synapse going, ouch. So does correlation equal cause? Sure. Otherwise, knowledge is impossible. The problem is the degree of correlation. And here, Kyper says the investigative nature of the human being, because they're made in the image and likeness of God, drives us deeper and deeper and deeper to understand the world around us and ourselves. In other words, we're never satisfied with a simple explanation. Let me say that again. This is beautiful in my mind from your Christian faith. The Christian idea and the Christian ideal is that you've been given a brain to use, to investigate the glory of God's creation, to understand it and you, and in so doing, to begin to understand something more about your place in creation. When we take that out of the equation, then in fact we've lost the moorings or the foundation upon which it is built. And as Van Til says, we now sit upon the lap of God to slap God in the face. Or to put it another way, you use borrowed capital to make your point. And so when I spoke to the scientist on the plane, he readily admitted that in fact, it is very, very hard to have a foundation for science unless we believe in an established order in the universe that goes past mere experimentation and data. In other words, we begin there. The information that we get through studies only confirms our viewpoint. It doesn't make it. We begin with a belief in coherence. And so Van Til says that all thought has a precondition, and the precondition of scientific investigation is that in fact that we have an abiding belief that there is a coherent ultimate that is past our ability to even understand. What do I mean by that? That sounds contradictory. In order to understand proximate knowledge, we must base our belief on ultimate knowledge. And if knowledge changes and is modified, it does not make sense unless we believe that there is an ultimate rationality which creates rationality itself. And the ultimate rationality, Van Til and Kyper have a name for it, and that name is God. And so the fact that we believe in science, by the way, you say you're a religion professor. I am. But I sure like reading this stuff. You're like, do you read that sort of stuff, Dr. Davis? Yes, it's fun. And I'm going to tell you, my faith increases. The more I read physics, astrophysics, quantum physics, the more my faith increases. And just one more point about quantum. Here we're discovering things that we never even knew, completely changing the way that we understand our world. The belief in a changing world only makes sense if, in fact, listen to the words of Stephen Hawking, only makes sense if there's a grand unifying theory. But listen now to Nietzsche. That doesn't make sense unless there's a unifying force, which doesn't come from nature. You're like, he's an atheist. That's correct. He doesn't believe it. He thinks it's wrong. But you do. And I know it because you keep watching Netflix. But ladies and gentlemen, Abraham Kyper was quite a fellow, and I hope that you will be as successful as he. Please feel free to start your own university, start your own newspaper, become prime minister, president, whatever it might be. But he did this because he believed he was providentially placed in linear time for the purpose of making the most of a life that had been given to him from a creator. I believe that deep in our hearts, there is a search for meaning, and that even all of our infinite longings cannot be explained, unless in fact there truly is an infinity and an infinite source. Anything that is contingent, to quote Thomas Aquinas, must find something that is not contingent in order for us to understand the contingency. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Well, we have a little, how much time do we have? About 2 minutes?
About 20 minutes.
Oh my word, really? All right, so lecture number 2. Well, let's do this. Let's take some time for questions. And I'm making a statement here about what I believe about science. Namely, that science makes more sense when understood with certain preconditions and presuppositions based upon the Christian worldview. That it's not accidental that science begins in a Christian environment. That it would be quite surprising if it began in another place. The idea of linear time, a creator, and you being creative has something to do with the advancement of science. Now, I understand there's been instances where religion has retarded science's growth. And while we're here, Alvin Toffler wrote a book years ago called The Third Wave, and his thesis was simply this: let's not let ethics get in the way of technology. Of course not. Technology ought to be completely free. We should be able to make all the nuclear bombs that we want, and all of the biological warfare, and also we should be able to make chemical weapons. There should never be I'm being sarcastic here for those of you who don't know me. That's ludicrous. But now we've got another problem. With the advancement of technology, we now need ethics more than ever. Because left to our own devices, there's no telling what we might do. And I'm concerned about the motivation of people who would do anything for just money. I think that we are in that area in that time now. And so, as we move further away from Christian ethics, nature hates a vacuum. And the result will be something will fill it, whether it be pragmatism, do what's best, what works is what's best. Works for whom? How long do I have to wait for it to work? And so for us to think through our faith, I think that we need it from an intellectual standpoint. And what I mean by this, we've abandoned the field. We've simply allowed other people to make gains in all of the areas as it relates to knowledge. And because of an anti-intellectual basis, we are no longer able to mount a counterattack or a response to the critiques that are there. And for some reason, faith seems to be distanced from knowledge. I don't understand that. Truth should not be afraid of questions. Rather, it should relish it as an opportunity to tell of the glory of God. And so, in any area where I have questions, I have a simple solution. Do more research. Look deeper. Try your best. believe that in fact that there are answers. A lot of times students will ask me, Dr. Davis, how do you come up with some of the stuff you come up with in the classroom? I think about it. Now that sounds sort of simple, but the reality is that's what I like to do, because I actually believe that I was created for such a time as this. And I hope you do too. And in coming to a Christian university, I want to encourage you to use your brain. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God with all of thy heart, soul, mind, and self. And if we just get 3 out of the 4, you haven't heard it. And so let's not leave the field. Let's stay on the field for the battle and believe that in fact we have something to say. I certainly believe that. And I want to encourage you to use your mind and to allow it to investigate wherever it might lead you. Now it sounds sort of dangerous. Oh my golly. But I'm not afraid of that. Not one bit. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've talked way too much in my mind. So let's hear some questions, thoughts, comments, whatever you want to do. Questions? Anybody? Yes, go ahead.
You were talking about coherence, made me wonder what your thoughts are on the end of Mark.
So far as...
Did it end at verse 8 or originally? Or?
Well, the simple answer is earliest manuscripts don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so, should we base our viewpoint on what the earliest manuscripts are? It's a debate within exegesis, and so if you ask me, do I think it ought to be there? Well, we have to be a little careful, and I actually do trust our scholars on this point. And the reason I say that is because there's another verse that no one wants to take out that is equally missing, and that is the woman caught in adultery. That also is not in the early manuscripts. And so we have to be a little careful just avoiding taking everything out that isn't particularly in those early manuscripts. Now, having said that, the history of the church has a very strong tradition as to the number of gospels. There are 8 people that I can think of right off the top of my head that have this statement. There's 4 gospels, and that's it. And so if those gospels are making their way around, which they are by the thousands, the number of things that we have, the Iliad, which is the second most copied book in the Bible, is 632. We have thousands, literally thousands of gospels over the same time period, which means they were copied feverishly. So I give the benefit of the doubt to the fact that those closest to the information copied them and copied them with amazing desire to multiply it because it was read in all the churches. And so I give the benefit of the doubt. Now, can I prove that Mark ought to be there or John? No, I can't. And so from an intellectual viewpoint, I have to say, I think it is an open question. Are there areas of the scripture that would come under? Yes. And there I would not be afraid of scholarship. I would say, bring the scholarship on. I don't have a theory of canonization that is going to say that we definitely have everything, because we just don't.
So I guess what I was trying to get at was, do you think the coherence of Mark would be broken if it ended at 8?
No, I understand what you're saying. I mean, in other words, because it cuts off sort of like that. I think if there is an ending, we've got it. I don't think there is another one. And so that's the argument for that ending. And the reason being is Mark cuts off so abruptly that in fact it would seem to be strange that a story about Jesus, or a gospel, or what Justin Martyr calls the memoirs of Jesus, would in fact end so abruptly. So I'm inclined to keep it. It's just simply because of what you say, that the sharp ending probably does create a question of, is this really how it ended? And I don't think it did. Carter.
So as for your Netflix example, about being having coherent endings,
Yeah.
One of my favorite movies of all time, The Lighthouse, has a very open-ended ending where there's no right answer to it.
Yeah.
So doesn't that kind of, how should I say, like put a dent in your
No,
coherence
because in
argument?
fact, what he does do in that movie, fortunately I've seen it, so I do know a little bit about it, and it's a very good movie. He does tie loose ends. where there's an openness to it, what he does is he ties a lot of loose ends in those final scenes. And so, no, I would say he actually is tying loose ends. If he left it completely open, we'd all be going, what? Okay. And I think it's okay to leave with a question, but in other words, you know that you're leaving it as an open-ended question. In other words, it's something for reflection. And so I might do that in a sermon. I might tell a parable where I leave it open for reflection. That's not the same as being, how shall we say, dispartite in our ending, where there's no semblance of rationality.
Gotcha.
More questions? Wish you guys are going easy on me. Yes, go ahead.
I got one question. So obviously there's evidence for a global flood. Like throughout history, the different civilizations, they've all talked about some massive flood. What do you say about the theory of an asteroid like completely wiping out the dinosaurs? Would that have been, how would you justify the global flood as the catastrophic event?
Yeah, so the flood can be, according to scriptures, the flood is created through the deep opening and continuing. In other words, it comes from the water itself and not an external force. Yeah?
Off of that question, will you like the canopy theory where like there was like an ice ball that like fell? What do you think about that? Just like going to the next question.
Yeah, let me answer that one first, and then we'll get to the canopy. I think, you know, God certainly can use his own creation to do what he wants for his purpose. It doesn't say that in the scriptures, though. So do I think an asteroid caused the floods that are talked about in different narratives, not just the Bible, but in a bunch of different narratives?
Yeah, well, the question I was having is like, how would you disprove that an asteroid actually caused these catastrophic events? I'm saying the flood is, I would say, the reason that we have all this massive like fossil record at one point in time. Like the way they try and justify all these fossils showing up at the same time is
Right.
because of this catastrophic event. And I would say that it's actually because of a flood. But what would you say is the way to defend that there actually was a flood versus an asteroid? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't, truthfully, I wouldn't really care about the asteroid, truthfully. And in other words, you're saying, well, how can you prove it's not an asteroid? Well, I don't know that I can prove it's not an asteroid, okay? I don't think that that's possible for me to say, okay, well, it's definitely not this because of that. I don't know that that information is where I would even want to go, because even just to use your example, the scriptures say that in fact the oceans basically open up and give off more water. Now, if I were going to try, I would say, okay, so something happened that we can explain physically, even though I don't know what it is. So I don't know the actual explanation other than that which is given us in the scriptures. Could something have caused the oceans and the rivers and everything to open up? Here we're talking the oceans. Yes, it could. The scriptures just simply say it did. Example, when Moses crosses the Red Sea, some people say Sea of Reeds, okay, a wind comes and separates the waters. Did a wind come and separate the water? Sure. Was it God? Yes. What makes it God? That God said it, that in fact God is there saying, okay, stand back and watch what I'm going to do. So God can use natural means to bring about his decrees, because nature is basically at his beck and call. And so if you ask me, how would I disprove it? I don't know that I would care to disprove it, because I'm sure that God used something. Is God bound to the earth, to use the earth or the cosmos? No. He could have created it like that if he so desires. In other words, here we're looking for a naturalistic explanation, but the reality is It's just simply that regardless of the way that God does it, it's God doing it. So that's what I would probably land on. If you say, how do we disprove that? I don't know and I don't care, because it's immaterial to me how it occurred. What occurred is more important. I'm not sure if that helps or not, but basically that's how I view it. So the canopy theory, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I don't know. I guess I was just curious on it. One of my friends from back home is in the master's program for it, and he did a project or paper on it, and he just was kind of talking about it. So I only know like a little bit, but I don't know. I just wanted to.
Yeah, so truthfully, I always view all of our scientific explanations and explanations that are not found in the scripture as proximate. What I mean by that is they could be true, okay? I'm not sure that the canopy theory is going to hit a whole bunch of empirical data. It would be simply a belief that comes from the scripture. I'm not sure it's necessary, to be honest with you. There's some question in my mind if it's necessary. And the idea that the earth doesn't receive any rain or any water. I honestly do not believe that to be the case, and I think that the scriptures actually talk against it. So, not going to be much help on that. Okay. Yeah?
In Life Origins, you learned a lot about how the Earth has like kind of segments of different times, like called epochs. So like the Cambrian explosion would be like an epoch, and then we're in a new epoch. So as far as like the cohesion of God, how would you relate that to like if we're constantly seeking for consistency or cohesion or ending? How do you relate that to us constantly being in a new epoch, or taking a rock and saying we can't conclude anything about yesterday?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a great question. So let me expand even more upon it. All of the conclusions that we have, that we understand, are based upon the knowledge that we have right now. Okay. If we are here 100 years from now, a lot of the knowledge that we feel very sure about will be wrong. Okay. And you might say, well, how can we have coherence knowing that in fact we have approximations of knowledge? Well, I think first, the fact that it's an approximation doesn't make it wrong necessarily. Okay, in other words, there's some things I think that we can feel pretty sure about. When it comes to knowledge changing and coherence, I guess my point, and Kyper's too on this, is we don't have to be afraid of the changing in knowledge, because we believe that in fact God is ultimate in coherence. And therefore, it's okay for us to have partial truths, because we believe that in fact that God has the ultimate truth. And so we can learn tremendous amount, which is why, frankly, I like science. I think it's great. And I love technology. Indoor plumbing, I think it's just a wonderful idea. I'm all for that. And electricity, I'm sort of thinking that's kind of neat. I like that. I don't want to make light of it, but at any rate, I find it illuminating in and of itself. So if you say to me, well, we're talking 20 years from now, we'll have a completely different system of energy. Great. I don't care. I mean, and more power to you. And this is sort of the beauty of Kyper's sphere sovereignty. He's really saying, allow your investigative work to lead where it may. We don't have to be afraid. Where we have to be careful is when we jump to conclusions that are anti-God. And I think what Van Til was trying to say is, we have to be very careful in that, because anytime that we begin to pull the rug out from underneath, if you keep going deeper, what you're going to find is the idea of absolute chaos is completely unknowable, and you're going to have to start with the presupposition whether you want to or not. Yeah?
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Chris?
Have you been keeping up with the James Webb Telescope? Just give me some of your thoughts on that.
So far as, I'm aware of it.
Well, the idea is looking into, getting close to that specificity or singularity when you're getting 400, 500 million light year new universes, very, 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 very old, and now we're dealing with a theory of knowledge here that is incomplete. But this idea that, you know, light coming to us is billions of years old.
Yeah.
So just tell me your insight, your thoughts on that, and then depending on that, how should the church begin to think through sort of James Webb and other kind of these big heavenly telescopes going out there and being in just incredible knowledge.
Yeah, well, if I may quote Kyper, we allow it to lead where it may, and we listen, and we don't shy away from information that even the sciences have. Are there times where it will contradict what we believe? Yes, and that's the time where we go, now wait a minute, okay? And just to give you an example, even though I really like Stephen Hawking's book on A Brief History of Time, there isn't any question what his motivation is, okay? And so here's the guy who really brought singularity, or the idea of a single starting point, to the consciousness of the world. And then he goes, now I want to prove that that's not true. And he says, if in fact singularity is true, it's an inescapable conclusion, there's a God. And so I sort of like all of the stuff that's going on so far as looking at the universe, and because what is occurring is all the information that we're studying shows a single starting point for the universe. And for me, it's marvelous, because that single starting point, and I'm aware there's all sorts of theories out here about how we have a single starting point. In other words, the issue isn't, is there a single starting point? The issue is what comes before that, if anything. And that's where we're getting into metaphysics. And even though we would call it physics, it is metaphysics. It is before our ability to describe it. And I reject the idea that in fact through trying to discover something in the finite, that we can understand how that which precedes the finite is developed. Or put it another way, by investigating our universe, that we can get past our universe. I don't think we can. And that's basically where a lot of people have raised questions with Stephen Hawking, because I shouldn't say we all know, we know that with a little bit of creativity, you can do a lot of fun things with mathematics, okay? It doesn't mean that math is wrong, but it does mean it has limitations. And when we go past that which is empirical, through whatever means, even mathematics, that's when I begin to say, well, we're gonna have to wait on that. I'm a little concerned. Example, string theory, numerous dimensions of time. This may surprise you all. I actually believe in different dimensions of time. If I had more time, I'd go into it. Sorry. But I think it's biblical. I think it's provable in the scriptures. Why? Time is a measurement of movement. If God has a thought, then in fact time exists prior to our creation. If God actually thinks about creating us before he creates us, which I'm going to say is the Christian doctrine as opposed to emanation, it just happens, then in fact there's a time prior to our time, and we have different dimensions of time. And so I'm going to say I think that even that's a Christian position, but I don't believe that this is accidental. And so I sort of like the idea of going into space and finding all this, because I think it really does tell us quite a bit about the origin of our universe. But I think it really tells us that there's a singular starting point, and I like that idea.
Yeah. Do you see the, I think right now it's 13.5 billion. I mean, how do you kind of, I mean, again, we're dealing with time, which can...
It's relative.
Sure. So give me your thoughts on James Webb confirming that, and also as Christians looking at
well, there I want to say the relativity of time can, we're really getting out here a little bit, but we're talking about science, aren't we? I do think that time can be different in different dimensions, and that there's no qualification that time has to be the same across all dimensions. And we know that time is relative, so I've never understood why it has to be consistent throughout all. In other words, the idea of absolute time is not something that I believe that the scriptures advocate. As a matter of fact, it says a day is like 1,000 days unto the Lord. And so I do think that in fact that in different dimensions there are different measurements of time, and that I think that we'll discover that. Now, have we discovered it? No, but I want them to keep trying so they prove my theory. You heard it here first. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
No, I may just be misunderstanding this, but if there are different dimensions of time,
Yeah.
does that mean there are alternate universes?
Yes. You're
So
like,
if
wait a
there-
minute, wait a minute, Dr. Davis, wait, you're getting really whacked out here.
Does that mean there's another me in some other cosmos or something?
Well, people have theorized that. As a matter of fact, Stephen Hawking actually theorizes that. I'm going to say the idea of another me, no, I don't think God would ever do that to our universe. The quick answer to your question is no, but that's a purely theological position. And when I say that, here's what I mean. Christ came to this place. He died once and for all. And the scriptures actually specifically say he did not die for angels. He died just for you. And so I do think it's a one-of-a-kind event, and I think it's a one-of-a-dimension event. And while there can be different dimensions, I don't think that there's anywhere where there's another Carter. I think we're it. I think that in fact you and I have one dimension, and we're in that one. You can get real speculative in all sorts of things, but no, I don't believe that there's a parallel universe. Is it logically possible? Yes. Is it probable? From my theological position, I'm going to say no. But it is my theology that's making that. It is the scriptures that are making me say that. Not making me, but are informing me in my conversation. Okay, maybe we'll just do one more question, and that'll be it. One more, because you've all been very gracious, very kind. You haven't thrown anything. I appreciate that. Thank you. No bodily injuries. Oh, well, let's give someone else a chance. One more person. Anybody who has not asked that question. Yes, go ahead, sir.
So I saw a thing about saying how like statistics in science says that hypothetically there are other planets that could inhabit life, and astronomers believe that there are planets with life on it. And
They have great faith, I know.
What is your how does that kind of clash or combine with?
Doesn't clash at
scripture?
all. Probability does not equal possibility, and possibility doesn't equal probability. And so the fact that something is possible doesn't mean it's probable. Let me give you an example. If you ask me, is something possible? In order to answer that question from a logical standpoint, I have to have comprehensive knowledge of all information, and I don't have that. So if you ask me, can you become an aardvark in the next 3 seconds? It is possible, but I think it's highly unlikely. Okay? And if you say, well, Dr. Davis, that's an extreme example. Not really. Because in fact, to say that life is probable on other planets just because we have life here, no, that doesn't logically work. Not at all. As a matter of fact, the problem with this, the idea is in fact the statistics themselves, the number of things that have to come together at any one moment. According to Richard Colling, if I remember, the physicist is 10 to the 53rd power. The universe itself and its trajectory cannot be off by 1/1,000,000th of an inch. And so what does that mean? There's not a whole lot of margin there for life to occur. And so the idea that since it occurred once means that it's probable that it could occur again, absolutely not. Just the opposite. Probability does not equal possibility. And I would argue quite opposite. And as a matter of fact, I know lots and lots of people in the physics world as well as in astrophysics who would say absolutely not. Carl Sagan likes to talk about it, but Carl Sagan has an agenda. Now, if you ask me, I might as well go here, is there intelligent life outside of our universe? Absolutely, no question about it. They're called angels. And if you ask me, do I think that they're all over the place out in who knows where? Sure. Why? The Bible talks about different classifications, and I would even go so far as to say I bet some people might even have seen some. But if you ask me, is there another place like Earth? It doesn't seem that way. And I actually think the statistics argue against it as opposed to for it. Well, that's it for today. Thank you all so much.